Since the world learned that Insomniac games were taking on Wolverine, the entire conversation has been about the future. Well, I've got an interesting question for you. What about the past? Because a lot of you might not remember that there's already been a Wolverine game from 2009, and it's well and truly R-rated, and to some degree, it's what Insomniac need to surpass, or at the very least live up to. So before we embark on a next-gen Wolverine adventure on PlayStation, let's look back to the Wolverine that time almost forgot. That is Activision's X-Men Origins Wolverine. So yeah, you heard that right, X-Men Origins, like the film. And yeah, it is indeed a movie tie-in, but it wasn't created equal to the rest of them. This is one of those rare occasions where the game actually ended up being better than the film, at least in some respects. Its release as a tie-in is actually pretty interesting because at the time the development team, Raven Software, desperately wanted to make an R-rated Wolverine game, but as you can imagine, the publishers at Activision didn't, and they wanted that consumer net to be cast as wide as possible to match the PG-13 film. So that compromise gave us the weirdest dual release of the era, you could argue, which brought a sanitized version of the game on Wii and PS2, and if you bought the game on the 360 or PS3, otherwise known as the Uncaged Edition, Raven got their way and bypassed the movie's restrictions and delivered the exact hyper-violent character study they always wanted to make from the start, and that's what this video is about. So like I said, it's a tie-in for the film, so if you're familiar with that, you'll recognize the basic framework. But Raven didn't just settle for gamifying the movie beats, because they actually took and injected some subplots taken from the comics and the expanded Wolverine lore, which went down incredibly well with fans. But before we go too deep into the narrative weeds, I do have a bit of an admission to make. I'm not really into superhero films, and I've never read a comic book in my life, and my exposure to Wolverine is almost exclusively from the film Logan. But to my untrained eye, that's a pretty decent bar to set for the character, so I think I've picked my poison pretty well. Either way, it's nothing that a quick scroll through Wikipedia can't fix, and the basic formula here is pretty simple. It's the framework of the film, padded out with some context from the comics, and some expanded Wolverine lore, if you will. So there you go. See, it isn't even that complicated. Right, so the game starts, and you're in a helicopter that's been hit, and you end up falling from what can only be described as a great height, and as if the game was trying to tell us something right away, the first thing we see is Wolverine macerating a guy from the sky in a crater of mud and blood. And then you get a close-up look at the damage from the fall, and you can literally see Wolverine's ribcage and his torn flesh. So it's definitely a definitive start as you mean to go on type scenario from the devs, and done in a way that puts all the cards on the table right away. And it's certainly the kind of thing that makes the comic book fans need a change of trousers. And honestly, even for me, it's pretty cool, I can't lie. And you'll be pleased to know that none of this is pre-rendered. This is all gameplay. And in fact, the visible damage that you sustain in-game is a way of keeping track of your health, if the giant red bar wasn't enough. So the more bloody, beaten, and parts you have missing, the less health you've got, which is a nice touch. And to be honest, it's something I was constantly admiring throughout the game, because seeing his exposed ribs and his organs is just flat out cool. And the fact that it doubles as this pseudo health bar is the icing on the cake. And to be honest, the only way that it could have been better is if it was the only indication you had. So imagine there was no traditional HUD at all, and this damage system was used as some sort of purely diegetic form of feedback, kind of like how Dead Space handles its rig. Regardless, the visual feedback here is pretty great, and for once in gaming history, the whole regenerating health trope is something that actually makes narrative sense because, well, it's Wolverine, so there's no complaints here, really. And that same damage model translates to everyone you'll quite literally rip and tear through, so stand back, Doom Guy. Logan's here, and he's not taking names, he's taking limbs. And the combat itself is pretty straightforward. You've got your two basic attacks, a normal slash and a heavy slash, plus an assortment of other abilities that you can trigger with button combos and unlocks as you play. And on the whole, it's a pretty satisfying loop. You'll be thrown into these arenas where hordes of hopeless goons come at you, and you do what Wolverine does. Cut them into pieces, literally. And it's easily where the game shines. And to be honest, I can't really imagine a game without the blood and dismemberment. It's just so, I don't know, Wolverine. How can a character like this not be gory? It honestly just boggles the mind that we've managed to get through how many Wolverine films without him drawing any blood. It's insane. Anyway, another major part of the gameplay loop is boss fights, and there's a lot of them, and not all of them are big story moments either. So early on you'll come across these big rock bastards, and basically you just have to rinse and repeat the same formula. Dodge the shit he throws at you, wait for a window to jump on his back, and do it all again until he dies. Now, you can actually hit his legs and not do what I just described, but you'll quickly realize that doing the lunge is the best way forward, so death by repetition. Now, none of that would be so bad, but each boss fight actually takes quite a while, and to some degree it takes a bit of the wind out of your sails. And I swear, you fight this exact same rock monster about 5 times, maybe more, and it gets to the point of feeling incredibly repetitive and frankly boring. And for a game that's otherwise fast-paced, these encounters stick out like a sore, albeit regenerating thumb, and it's part of the game I can categorically say I didn't like, which, if you're familiar with the game, might sound like a bit of a problem. Well, because it is, but we'll get to that. And while we're on the topic of things I don't like, I might as well mention the platforming and puzzles. They're a constant part of the experience, even if you couldn't strictly call it a platformer. What I will say about them, though, is that they're a bit shit. Now, not because they're too difficult, because they're actually way too easy, but because they're entirely ruined by a terrible camera. And a lot of the time, the perspective pulls so far back that it's genuinely hard to see where you're supposed to land, or even what direction you're facing sometimes. And other times, the camera just clips straight through a wall, which is especially annoying on sections where you need to precisely aim your leaps. And I found multiple areas in the campaign where you just can't gauge the distance, or there's some sort of moving target, which is quite annoying. Now, it's not a major crisis, but it's definitely something that made me tighten my grip around my poor Xbox controller, so getting cheesed by a bad camera angle during a particularly annoying puzzle jump wasn't exactly a highlight, I'll say that much. But overall, not too terrible, just overly easy and affected by the camera, which obviously isn't ideal. And then, of course, you've got the puzzles, which basically amount to dragging these columns around that you can stand on, or having these little pressure pads which allow you to raise and lower certain platforms. And it's all a bit easy, all a bit non-consequential, and just a part of the game which I thought, I don't know, they could have done more with this, because you do have this feral vision that allows you to see things and everything gets highlighted that you can interact with. So for the most part, it's just stuff that you can ignore. It's not that bad, but it's just a part of the game that they could have got more from. I feel like the whole puzzle aspect to this game is really sort of limp and doesn't really have any meat on the bones. And it kind of made me think about the new Indiana Jones game, which is a little bit weird because I've played this after Indiana Jones. I was disappointed by the puzzles in that game, and I've been disappointed by the puzzles in this game. They're all just too easy. They don't provide enough of a challenge, and if you do get stuck, it's probably because the game design just wasn't good enough to make it obvious that there was a puzzle. Like, there was this section here where I just didn't realize that this box I jumped over was something that I could push forwards, so obviously I used the feral sensors, and then I was like, oh, I can push that. And I don't think that's necessarily me being bad at the game, that's just these puzzles being so simple that you perhaps might not necessarily think about that being an option, if that makes sense. So overall, not a big deal, but they didn't add anything to the game either, and I found them a little bit annoying, so that's where I'll leave it, I guess. But thankfully, when it comes to gauging distances, the combat doesn't disappoint, because Raven gave Logan this incredibly cool lunge ability, which I guess is his signature move. I'm not really sure. Wikipedia didn't specify. Either way, it lets you leap across the map, and it's especially great because whoever you've targeted will shriek with fear as you fly towards them claws first. And quite honestly, that never really gets old. And mechanically, it's perfect for closing the gap in the frequently massive arenas you're thrown into. But on a personal note, it's by far my absolute favorite thing to do, and there's something deeply satisfying and primal about seeing a guy who thinks he's safe with his rifle at the other side of the map, only to have Wolverine flying onto him, sticking his claws into wherever he sticks them, and well, I guess it's best not to ask too many questions, I think. And speaking of Traversal, the campaign takes you to a surprisingly varied group of locations, and you'll bounce between lush jungles, snowy forests, and high-tech research facilities. And looking back at my playthrough, I think it's easy to divide the game into these distinct, recognizable chapters based entirely on the environment, which I think is a massive plus because it keeps the game fresh and stops you from feeling like you're running down the same corridors over and over. And admittedly, that does end up becoming a bit of a thing near the midpoint of the game where you invade the Sentinel factory, which, looks suspiciously like the Weapon X facility you escaped just a few hours previous. But on the whole, I would say that it's a visually interesting game from a setting perspective, and it won't blow your socks off or anything, but Raven have clearly put some effort into making each of the areas feel distinct enough to remain novel, at the very least. Now, I mentioned the button combos earlier, which was another element of the game which helps it feel novel, because you unlock abilities as you go, and by mid to late game you've got this massive range of powers at your disposal, which means that legitimately you're more powerful than you were when you started, which is the ultimate superhero power fantasy. And it's also a good feedback loop which makes the game feel like you're building up to something, which is always nice. And you're constantly picking up upgrades hidden throughout the missions and developing your skills via a standard XP system, which is fueled by killing enemies and hunting down collectibles. And combined, these systems actually give the game a decent amount of replayability and value, because you're obviously encouraged to explore and you'll inevitably not find everything or maximize every power on your first run, which gives you a genuine incentive for the second playthrough. And plus, completing the game unlocks hard mode, which means that if you're chasing achievements or trophies, you'll need to do it the second time around anyway. But luckily, I do genuinely consider the gameplay loop to be good enough to where I'd consider more than one playthrough, which is always good. Which brings me to something that I promised I'd return to, which is the boss fights. And I've already mentioned that the rock monster was repetitive and slow. So what would you think if I told you that they introduced another boss not much further into the game, and one that's more or less a total reskin of the rock monster? Well, that's exactly what they did, and to rub salt into the wound, you have to fight this giant prototype thing multiple times as well. And here's the real kicker. At one point, the game throws like 5 of them at you all at the exact same time. No, I'm not joking. And I want to reiterate that it's not that they're hard, it's just that they're incredibly tedious. And to do 5 of them all in one go, Jesus Christ, man. And it's the same issue. To have this slow, repetitive formula dragged out so many times just really slows down the game. And it really made me long for that adamantium bullet that Logan gets at the end of the film, which I've now ruined, so spoiler alert. But that doesn't stop there. I'm going to spoil some more things, because the game has an absolute fetish for boss fights, and all of the fights have their own distinct miasma that'll linger just that little bit too long. And to keep it brief, I'll say that, surprise, surprise, all of them are way too long, and the one against the geezer with the cane, Gambit, the Riddler, whatever his name is, that lasts like a whole 2 missions, with multiple phases all individually slower than molasses, and ending with both of them agreeing to some sort of truce, because that makes sense. We've been trying to kill each other for the last hour and a half, and now we're just going to go on a road trip. Please make it make sense. It's really annoying. And actually, despite my disdain, I do want to level with you a little bit. They're not all equally this bad, and it's just that whenever I was playing these boss fights, I was either thinking, fucking hell, this is quite long, or fucking hell, this is quite annoying. And when it comes to the latter, it's absolutely got to go to the Sentinel boss fight. And again, it's long, it's a protracted mess, but the worst part is specifically the section where you're skydiving toward it. You have to avoid all these falling debris, or I guess they're not falling, they're going upwards, but you have to avoid them, whatever the case, which is fine, but they're all sort of obscured by this smoke which is coming out of the robot, and you can't really tell what's going on, so you're supposed to dodge them, but it just ends up feeling cheap because you can't really see them that good. And then it ends with a QTE at the end, which you have to tap your controller so fast that you can't do it with your thumb, which has never been an issue for me in all of my years of gaming. And when I went to look on Google about this, like, I can't get through this QTE, is this a thing? There's forums full of people talking about how you have to change your grip and, you know, do it with your finger instead of your thumb, which, like, what the fuck? That has never been a thing in my many years gaming, so I thought it was bugged. The mind just boggles at how these boss fights have just become so annoying, long, and repetitive. And I suppose that brings me to the final boss fight, which is against Deadpool. And you know what? In fact, no, I'm not going to talk about this. I don't want to. It was better than the film, I'll say that. Which I suppose with the mention of Deadpool brings us to the end of the game. But sadly, that's not really where my critiques end, because while I do really like the game overall, it has this bizarre obsession with flashbacks. It constantly drags you back to that African jungle, and I genuinely don't understand why they didn't use that mechanic to explore literally anything else. Now, think about the film. The intro montage shows Wolverine fighting through the decades of human history, and that could have been a really incredible thing to play. Now, sure, it might not have made perfect sense or aligned with the narrative framework, but given that the developers clearly have a PhD in padding out game length, I'm sure they could have figured it out. Instead, no, we're constantly yanked back to this jungle to fight another rock monster and solve some more shit puzzles. And it's just massive wasted potential. How cool would it have been to storm Utah Beach as Wolverine? And let's be real, this is Raven Software and Activision we're talking about, and surely they've got some World War II assets lying around somewhere, and they could have made it work. I don't know, for everything that it does well, it feels like there's just as many negative things to say. But despite all of its flaws, I still found myself enjoying the raw spectacle of it all. And I suppose that's what we can hope for. We want more of that spectacle and far fewer of the annoyances when it comes to Insomniac's Crack of the Whip later this year. Either way, I'd say that Origins is a must-play if you're a fan of Wolverine or if you're just looking for some violent, mindless fun. It's certainly not the sole masterpiece of superhero gaming that some might lead you to believe, but it's far from the worst, and you could do a whole lot worse as you wait for Logan's next outing. But hey, not long now. That is, of course, unless you're watching this video at some point in the future. And if you are, well, how is it? Let me know in the comments.
You sure as hell didn't work out like we planned. That doesn't mean giving up. This world may be broken, but I've got just the tools to fix it.